So we're looking at point slope form again, and instead of giving us the slope and 1 point, they're going to give us 2 points. So we're going to have to calculate the slope ourselves. So up here at the top, we're going to put the formulas that we're going to need for today. So we still need our y minus y1 equals m parentheses x minus x1 formula that we've been using for the last couple of days. But they're not going to give us m this time, so we're going to calculate that using the slope formula, which is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And this looks weird because you've got y1 and x1, and you had y1 and x1 over here. We'll talk about that when we get through the examples. You could label it consistently all the way through, or you might not want to. It's sort of going to be a personal preference thing. But they're going to give us 2 points, which is enough to find the slope. We've done that before. And then we can just pick one of these points to use to put into the point slope form. So on the first part, it says write the point slope form of the equation of the line through the given points. So point slope form is just doing this part. So this is like the shorter ones, and then on the bottom we'll go all the way through to what we were doing yesterday. So the first thing that we're going to do is figure out what the slope is. So I'm going to put over here, step 1, find m, which is find your slope. And then step 2, we will pick a point to put into our equation. So I'm leaving that fairly simple, but after we go through it, I think that'll be enough to kind of jar your memory on what we're doing. So to use the slope formula, y2 minus y1, x2 minus x1, we're going to label these. So I'm going to go x1, y1, x2, y2. That's just the easy way to go through and get everything labeled so that we can put it into the formula. So the formula says we're going to do y2 minus y1. That just means the second y minus the first y. So I'm going to have 1 minus, that's just y2 minus, and then y1 is negative 1. This is where we struggled a little bit with slope formula. We have to make sure that there's a minus, and if there's a negative that we have that too. And then on the bottom, we're going to have x2 minus x1. So x2 is negative 5, and then there's subtraction in the formula, and then there's x1 is 1. So to figure out the slope, we're going to do keep, change on both of these. So this is going to become 1 plus positive 1, and then we keep the negative 5. We're going to change it to plus and have negative 1. So we can figure out the slope then. So I'm going to have 1 plus 1, which is 2. And then negative 5 and negative 1 is negative 6. And then we're going to look at that and go, hey, can we reduce that fraction? Yeah, we can divide it by 2. So if I divide both of these by 2, I get my slope as negative 1/3. So what we're going to do with that is we're going to put that into this equation. Now we only need 1 point to be this x and this y. If you want it to be this one that we had, because that has x1 and y1 and that's what it looks like up here, that's okay. So that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this x1 and y1 to put into here. So I'm going to have y minus negative 1,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I am off the screen. Let me just zoom out a little bit. So I'm going to do y minus, and then using this y, negative 1, equals, and then m is the number we just found, negative 1/3, parentheses, x minus this right here, which is 1.
So basically all you have to find the fraction.
You have to find the slope, and then we're gonna change this to plus. So it'd be y plus 1. So for this first part, we are just trying to get the slope in there, and then you could pick the other point. I could pick this point to go down here, which means there's actually 2 possible answers, and if you decide to do that one, I'm okay with it. Well, it just means that we have 2 possible answers. because you could put either point in for that. Even though it says x1, y1, and I went ahead and just used that one, you could use this one and put it in, and it would still be the same line. So it's one of those things about high school is sometimes there's 2 or 3 or sometimes 5 different ways to write the same equation. And I take them all. If it's point slope form, it'll be fine. There's basically 2 different ones you could come up with. All right, so let's do the next one. So our first step, I'm going to label everything x1, y1, x2, y2, and we're going to use the slope formula. So we subtract the y's and then subtract the x's. So I'm going to have 3 minus 5, because those are my y's. I should make that more curly. That way it doesn't look like an x. And then subtract my x's. And remember, if I'm going this direction, 3 minus 5, I have to go this direction, 0 minus 1. Okay, so I'm going to keep change. So 3 plus negative 5, and 0 plus negative 1. And then can you tell me what that's going to come out to be on the top and on the bottom? So let's start with the top. 3 plus negative 5. Negative 2. And then 0 plus negative 1's not too bad, negative 1. And then can I do anything else with that? You can. I can take 2 divided by 1, and I can get rid of those negatives because they would cancel. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. This would just come out regular old 2. You could use it as 2 over 1, but that's going to make it more complicated when we do stuff with it later. So if we can simplify it down to just this, it's okay. So here the negatives canceled, and 2 divided by 1 is just 2. So if you can go ahead and divide it, go ahead and do that. And then I'm just going to go ahead and use this first point in my point slope form. So we'd have y minus 5 equals my slopes from over here, 2, and then x minus 1 from over here. And for point slope form, that's all I have to do. The only thing we're going to add to this is on some of them, they're going to want you to distribute and do the stuff we were doing yesterday. But on the top part, we just have to do this only. Okay? Let's do a couple more. I've just got some strange situations on 3 and 4. So it's not like I'm trying to torture you by doing 4 of them. I wanted to have some of these little details on weird things that can come up. So on number 3, we're going to find our slope first, our M for mountain in Latin or French or whatever it is. I think it was French. So we're going to do, I've got a label, x1, y1, x2, y2, and then I'll scoot this down a little bit. So we've got, we'll have 0 minus 3 and 0 minus negative 3. If I put those into the slope formula. So this would be the same thing as 0 plus negative 3 and 0 plus 3. If I do keep, change. So I'm keeping the 0, but I'm changing signs on everything else. So we're just going to get negative 3 over 3. So what could I do with that? Divide it, and so that'll divide evenly. It's a negative divided by a positive, so we get negative 1. I don't want to box that. My brain was wanting this to be over, but it's okay. So we get negative 1, and then I'm just going to go ahead and use these first points. So I can do y minus 3 equals negative 1, x minus negative 3. So we're putting these into the formula. We're subtracting both. And then you can clean that up by going ahead and doing keep, change right here and making this x plus 3. This is an okay answer. I will tell you sometimes they'll go ahead and distribute the negative 1 just to get rid of parentheses, but this is what I'm looking for. It's just this right here. Okay? So the only thing that's really different is you have to find the slope. They didn't give it to you. And then you can just pick this point and put it in. Last year they were asking, could we use the 0, 0? You could, because if you put minus 0 and minus 0, then a bunch of stuff drops out and it's a shorter equation. They were trying to figure out how to write less. You can do that if you want to use the other point. So I'm just trying to be consistent. I'm just always using the first point. And my answer key, the computer always uses the first point, but you could put the second point in there and it would look different, but the line actually falls in the same place. It's a little bizarre, but that's just something that happens. All right, so let's look at number 4. So you guys are going to help me set up slope formula. So m equals, so what would go on the top? So I'll set this up. x1, y1, x2, y2.
What if it, so you have to put 0 and 5?
So let's look up here. We want to do y2 minus y1.
Oh.
So if I come down here and look, I want to do my second y value minus my first y value. So my second y value is -5. And then the formula has a minus in it. And then my other y value is a 5.
Okay.
And then let's try the bottom. x2 minus x1. So 5 minus 0. Good. So you just want to make sure we're getting the order the same on the top and the bottom. So the top, I could do keep, change. It would be -5 plus -5. Down here, it's just 0. We could just go ahead and call that 5 because 5 minus 0 is not very exciting. What is -5 plus -5? -10. Awesome. And then if I have that over 5, can that be reduced or divided in any way? Yes, I could divide both of those by 5. I just end up with -2. So sometimes you'll have a fraction and sometimes you're going to get a whole number.
Yes.
And so then if I put this into the formula, I'm going to use 0 and 5. So I'll have y minus 5 equals -2 parentheses x minus 0. Now if you have x minus 0, you can write it all out just so it's the same as all the others. But I will tell you, a lot of times the computer will leave the -0 off, and it will just say -2, and then it'll have x. It'll just take this times this and leave the 0 off. And so this, for you guys, I'm going to say is optional. But I want you to know that sometimes when we're looking at answer keys, that's what it says. Because the computer is going to use as little ink as possible. That's how they program those in. So on the bottom part of this, we're just going to take it one step further and do the distributing and stuff. I'm going to keep recording. So I'll put that up on Classroom for you. All right, so, and let me give you this. So on the bottom, we start by doing all of the same things we just did, but our final answer is going to be slope-intercept form, which is the y equals mx plus b. So we add those steps back in where we distribute to get rid of the parentheses and get y alone, so that, and when you do that, all of the answers come out the same, which is why I think they like us to go back to that one equation. And for our story problems, which I'm excited to show you guys next week, what this is actually useful for is kind of exciting. And when you get it down to that y equals, you can get some really useful information. All right, so I'm going to start by labeling this x1, y1, x2, y2. And we're still going to find the slope first. So we're going to set that up. So we do y2 minus y1. So -2 minus 2 and 0 minus 4 on the bottom. So since we're subtracting on both of those, I'm going to go ahead and do keep, change. So keep the -2, change it to addition, change this to -2, and then 0 minus 4 would just be 0 plus -4 if you want to think of it that way.
You're going to post this on Google Classroom?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and I gave you the worksheet, so you're good. So we'll have -4 over -4. So that's the same number on the top and bottom. We have the same number on the top and bottom of a fraction. What happens? It just turns into +1. So I'm going to go ahead and use that, and I'm going to go ahead and use the first point to put into my equation. So y minus 2 equals, there's my slope is 1, and then I'll have x minus 4. So this is point slope form, What they're asking us to do when they say slope-intercept form is to keep going like we did yesterday. So we're going to distribute the 1 to get rid of that. So you just get 1x minus 4. And then we have to get y alone. So we add 2 to both sides. So if I have negative 4 and plus 2, what am I going to get? Negative 2. She just doesn't want to say it. So this is an acceptable answer. Sometimes they'll leave the 1 off the x and they'll just call it y equals x minus 2. Either way. I take it either way, with the 1 or without the 1. They're both correct. All right. So let's go to number 6. So this is my x1, y1, x2, y2. So we're going to set up the slope. So if we're setting up the top, y2 minus y1, what is it going to look like?
Negative 2 minus negative 1.
Good. Negative 2 minus negative 1. And then what do we have on the bottom? Yeah, you do this one. What do we have on the bottom?
5 minus 0.
5 minus 0. Good. So on the top, we can change this to negative 2 plus 1, and that'll just be 5. 5 minus 0. So negative 2 plus 1 comes out negative 1, and I have 5. I can't reduce that. We're going to have to leave it as a fraction, negative 1/5. Fractions happen. It's just part of life. So I'm going to go ahead and use the first point and that slope to set up point slope form. So I will have y minus negative 1 equals negative 1/5 parentheses x minus 0. Now automatically I see x minus 0, well something's going to drop out here. You could go ahead and distribute like normal and just go through the motions if that's what your brain wants you to do. So I can take negative 1/5 times x, and then negative 1/5 times negative 0 is just going to be 0. So you could write plus 0 or minus 0 because it's 0. And on this side, oh, I forgot to change this. So y minus negative 1 would become y plus 1. So I'll just go ahead and do that down here. So what's left is then to get y by itself. So how do I get rid of plus 1? Minus 1. And having that 0 there is not a bad thing when you go to do this step, because then you have something to subtract it from. So you end up with y equals negative 1/5 x minus 1 as the final answer. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and finish out. There's a little twist that happens towards the end, so I don't want to cut this too short. We'll just buzz through these. And I know if you cut your paper like I did, you ran out doesn't have a lot of room down there, so I'm going to write small. All right, so we're going to set up our slope. So y2 minus y1 is negative 5 minus 1. x2 minus x1 is 2 minus 0. So if we do keep change, that becomes negative 5 plus negative 1. And then 2 minus 0 is just 2. So if I have negative 5 and negative 1, and I add them together, I get negative 6. And then divided by 2. So what's that going to give me? Nobody wants to say it out loud while we're recording. It's okay. Negative 3. So then I'm going to use this first point, and I'll put that into my point slope form. So y minus 1 equals negative 3 and x minus 0. So I'm just using this point for my x1, y1 to put into this equation. We can distribute out the negative 3. So we get negative 3x plus 0. And over here I have y minus 1. So if I want to get y by itself on this one, we would add 1 to both sides. So y equals negative 3x plus 1. All right, the last one is the one that's a little bit more interesting. So let's set up the slope first. First of all of my numbers are negative. So when you set up the slope formula, we have to be very careful. So we start with -4 minus, and then -5, -3 minus, and then -1. So when you're subtracting with integers, my method is keep, change, change. Keep the first number, change this to plus, change that to +5. Make this -3 plus +1, and then we just have to know how to do integer subtraction. So -4 plus 5 is 1. -3 plus 1 is -2. So there's just one negative in there. We're going to keep it as -1/2, and I'm just going to stick the negative in the front of the fraction. There's only one of them, so we can't cancel it out. And then I'm going to use this first point from up here. So I'm going to have y minus -5 equals -1/2 times x minus -1. So we can change all of the minus negatives to plus. So we keep the y, change this to positive, keep this to 5. -1/2, make this x plus 1. All right, so it's the distributing that can get interesting with fractions. This one's not so bad on the distribution part, but when we start doing more fraction stuff, it gets a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to distribute that out, and we get -1/2 x and -1/2. And over here I have y plus 5. Actually, this might not be that bad. So our last step is just to get the y by itself. So I have to get rid of +5. So we have to subtract 5 from both sides. So I'm going to come over here since I ran out of room. So I'm going to have y equals -1/2 x. I have -1/2 and -5. If you want to, you could call that -5 1/2. Or you could do some other fancy stuff and end up with -11/2.